Welcome back. It's been quite a while since I've been with you, and we're going to get back into the swing of things. Hope your genealogy research has been successful while we've been away, and hopefully the classes that we'll have for the remaining part of the year will help you improve your researching. Today we're going to talk about cemetery research. And yes, that's actually a lady digging a grave. She's measuring for the size of it. It's a stock photo that I picked up that I just find interesting, to say the least. So let's talk about cemetery research. Cemeteries are where you find them. And this is an interesting one. If you go to the Home Depot today in Carmack, New York, you'll meet a cemetery right there in the middle of the parking lot. It's one where the world built around a pioneer cemetery that dates back into the 1630s. So it's interesting. And the story is, the comment is true. Cemeteries are where you find them. My wife and I were in Connecticut just a couple of weeks ago and trying to find cemeteries for her. Unfortunately, they may be where you find them, but you have to find them. I found one of three, and I'm sure we drove past the other two, but they were just hidden away in the forest in such a way that we were unable to see them from the highway. So what we're going to cover today is why cemetery research, challenges that you have in doing cemetery research. We'll talk a little bit about the types of cemeteries, the kind of cemetery records, which is really important, where people might be buried when you don't know where to find them, online cemetery research, offline cemetery research. We'll talk a little bit about find a grave in depth because it is the big player on the table for cemetery research, and talk a little bit about what if there's nothing online. So why cemetery research? Well, one of the reasons is you can't always find documents that detail all the facts of your family's lives. And sometimes you just can't find documents that provide good death records. And so cemetery records become a good substitute. And so problems with cemetery research, though, include things like there's no stone available anymore. The sexton records don't exist. The cemeteries no longer exist themselves. People were buried at home or along the trail and nobody knows about it. Gravestones exist, but they're not online. Burial records are only in non-digitized books. A lot of things we call transcriptions, where people recorded the stones in cemeteries. And sometimes those books are not online and they're the only place that has a record. And burials can sometimes be in unexpected place or a non-expected place, or they just never happened. And so we have all kinds of issues that deal with cemetery records. And one of the things we have to realize is stones are nice, but stones are not immortal. And so oftentimes for burials from a long time ago, the stones are no longer readable today. And this is why we need to turn sometimes to things that are more out of date, what would seem to be out of date, that were created a long time ago because they could have been created back when the stones could actually be read. The cemetery that we were in just a couple of weeks ago, there were several stones that there's absolutely no way to read them today. But I found a transcription of the cemetery, and there's quite a few burials listed in the transcription that there are no stones for. And these are stones that have either disappeared or they're no longer readable. Okay, what are the kinds of cemeteries? There's basically four kinds of cemeteries. One's a family cemetery. I have one of these. This is a picture of one of my families. My fourth great grandfather's buried in the background there where the flowers are in his backyard from when he died in 1823. And that house was, until just recently, still owned by the family. And part of the house that's there today is the original house that he built back in the early 1800s. It's over 200 years old now. Other cemeteries are often found around churches or other private locations. It could be Masonic orders and things like that. Another kind of cemetery that's fairly common are governmental cemeteries. We have all the veteran cemeteries around the United States and even in other countries where our servicemen choose to be buried, or sometimes we're just buried there because they died in battle and this was a cemetery nearby. And then there are commercial cemeteries, and those are the ones that we most often see around big cities, and they're often huge cemeteries. This Greenmount Cemetery has 250,000 burials in it. And I've seen others in Chicago that were public or commercial cemeteries that were also extremely large. One in Salt Lake has more burials in it than I think people living in Salt Lake today. So in any case, commercial cemeteries are often very large. So these are the four kinds of cemetery classifications that you may have to deal with, and they all have somewhat different rules and ways you can deal with them, especially when it's a family cemetery. Okay, there are several different cemetery records, and many people are not available or not aware of all of them. One kind is created by the person that is the caretaker for the cemetery, and this is called a sexton. And the sexton keeps a book, and you'll see a picture there of a book where burials are recorded. I've seen other kind of books where it's just like a single line of information for each burial. But the sexton can often tell you exactly where in the cemetery the person is buried. And that relates to a second kind of record called a plat record. And this is essentially a map of the cemetery where they show you the different sections of the cemetery. And then when you find from the sexton what section the person lived in, the plat map will help direct you to where that tombstone should be found. Another kind of record is usually created by, it could be a church, a local government, it could be a genealogy society, but it's some kind of a transcription of the records that they have available to them that describe burials and their location, where they occurred, and oftentimes when they occurred. And so that's another kind of record you might look for. That particular one that you see there, this kind of yellow in color, came from the South Central Pennsylvania Genealogical Society, where they have gone through and recorded on 3x5 cards every burial they know of in York County, Pennsylvania. Okay, and those burials happen to be in Altland's Meeting House in Paradise Township. So I know where to go to find those records. Okay, and another kind of record is, of course, the tombstones themselves, if they're readable. The inscriptions on the tombstones will be a kind of record that, of course, you're looking for. Okay, where could they be buried? That's often a problem because you have people, you may know their death, but you don't know where they're buried. Well, there's several kinds of records that might help you. It's often recorded on death certificates if the person had a death certificate. Found in obituaries like the one on the right for Ida M. Myers, where it says at the bottom that she was buried in Emmanuel Cemetery in Lewisberry. You might be able to find something from family knowledge, letters, or records that are floating around in the family. Mortuary or funeral home records often tell where the burial occurred because that was part of their services, getting the body to the cemetery. And then there's those little cards that are passed out at funerals, funeral cards. And many times people have collected those and saved those, and those will often tell you where the person was buried. So there's quite a few different ways to find out where the person is buried through records. Now, identifying and locating the cemeteries online are not always easy. There's problems. One begins with the fact that even the big guy, which is, of course, find a grave, there is no one place you can go to find every cemetery that's online. Nobody has them all. And so no matter what resource you turn to, they're often going to be missing cemeteries. And you're going to find out that some cemeteries aren't listed anywhere. And so you may have trouble online trying to find certain cemeteries because they're just not listed by anyone. And then finally, one thing I've learned by working in Pennsylvania, in York County, Pennsylvania, extensively and over a long period of time is many cemeteries have their name changed. And so what may appear to be a cemetery that's missing isn't really missing, it's just using a new name. And you have to figure that out. So there's quite a few little issues that come up when you're trying to find records for people online, especially when it comes to cemetery records. Some clues for where people are buried is where are other family members buried? The one that's a risky one is when you have multiple wives and the first wife, let's say, dies young, or it could be the husband, dies young. Your first clue might be where the spouse is buried. But very often the spouse is buried somewhere else and they're buried with the second spouse, and the second spouse doesn't really want to be buried with the first spouse. And so families won't be buried together in that case. But very often, if you can find some of the children's burials, you'll often find parents there too, especially if you find young children that died. Okay, families do tend to be buried near their church. So if you know what church they attended, you might check that out, especially if the church has a cemetery of its own. That's the ultimate in buried near their church. And then the last one would be the closest cemetery to where they lived. And that's how we finally solved my second great grandfather's burial location, is by realizing that he was just buried right down the road about a mile from where he was living when he passed away. And nobody had ever thought about that in the past. And we were able to put two and two together with some family traditions and ideas and things like that. Okay, there are several sources. We aren't going to show you all of them, but these are the best sources that there are. This video is always recorded, and put up on YouTube. Also, we provide through our blog, which is listed on the page for our YouTube channel, we supply PDFs of the slides. So there is a slide that will be available that shows all of this information. You won't have to copy it down real quick. Well, first thing to understand when we talk about these is there's two main ways to view burials. One is by looking at the stones themselves, and the others are transcriptions. A transcription is when somebody's walked down the rows in the cemetery and written down everything that was found on the various graves. They then take those records and either alphabetize them or they leave them in row order so that you know who was buried next to each other. So you'll hear me talk about, this one has images of stones and this one has transcripts. That's what we're talking about. But these are the big players. Some have been around for quite a while. Okay, try to remember, like we said, not every cemetery is online. Not every cemetery's been transcribed. Websites and transcriptions are not always complete. I would say most often are not complete. Some burials simply are not recorded anywhere, and burial places for some people are just not known. In spite of the fact that some researchers out there try to create a place of burial for people, sometimes we just don't know where. Okay, I did a little number crunch the other day, just out of curiosity, for the United States. The total people who have lived in the United States since 1620, as of 2010, based on the records that I came up with, and the sources are down at the bottom of the screen, were about 545 million people, 55% of which are actually living today. So those that had died were somewhere in the vicinity of 245 million people. So that's just an interesting number we can bury back in our head, saying that if we had a record for everybody who had lived in America and the United States since 1630, we ought to have about 245 million graves recorded and searchable. Okay, so let's look at some of these bigger sites. Interment.net may be one you're not familiar with. That's actually one of the oldest ones. Been around for quite a while. It doesn't have just US, as you can see on the ribbon there. It also includes Canada, United Kingdom, Ireland, Australia, and more. It deals only in transcriptions. So there are no images of stones and things like that. And to search for people, you do need to realize, and they show it there, you got to search by last name, comma, first name. If you do it the normal way we search, first name, then last name, you'll probably never find anybody. And again, this site does have records from other countries. This is an example of what you'll get if you get a hit. I was searching for somebody who happens to be buried in New Hope Cemetery in Glen Rock, York County, Pennsylvania. And this tells me a little bit about it, gives me the address, gives me a phone number from probably 20 years ago. It gives me the GPS coordinates for where it's located, which could be helpful. Then there's a written description of how to find it. It said at that time when this transcription was made, it was in good condition and still accepting burials. It had many old tombstones that were too old to read even then, and these dated back into the 1700s. And it talked about who owned the cemetery and said this is not a complete listing of burials in the cemetery. The records below were provided by contributors to Interment.net. Last edited date was 2009. So what, 14, 15, 16 years ago. And they had 441 transcriptions. And they'll show you what they did is they wrote down the person's name and then wrote the exact way the dating went. In this case, everybody was buried with just a year, no days and months on any of them. And that's very common. But that's an example of what you'll see when you see a transcription. I can tell this one is most likely not a down the row transcription record because everybody's in perfect alphabetical order. Okay, another one comes from an old site that's not really very usable anymore for everything it used to have, the US GenWeb. And the US GenWeb had a cemetery transcription project. And there's no known number of total burials listed there, but some states had over 1 million names in them. So there could be quite a few. But when you go there, you click on state projects, and then each state comes up and you click on the state, and then you can drill down to the locality and then the cemeteries and see transcriptions, just like the one you saw from InterNet. Another one that's similar is the RootsWeb Cemetery Project. RootsWeb is one of our old genealogy sites. And no known total burials. Back in 2018, it had 3.5 million burials listed. This site's now owned by Ancestry. I believe the records that were found there are actually found on Ancestry now, but you can still see them by going through their cemetery records. Okay, Billion Graves. Billion Graves is owned by Otter Creek Holdings since 2013 and partners with Family Search, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. So Billion Graves is going to be found, their records are going to be found at Family Search, MyHeritage, and Find My Past. It has over 50 million headstones. But remember, these are worldwide. And what's neat about them is they don't post things unless there's a headstone. That can be limiting, but that's also good because what they do have is got to be fairly accurate. And it provides you with the GPS coordinates for that burial. Now, having done a Boy Scout project for one of my grandsons, and done a project with him in a cemetery and watch multiple phones being used to take pictures, I realized that not everybody's GPS is pinpoint accurate. Some of our tombstones that we found, my grandson's project ended up being in the middle of the football field at the high school next door, or out in the middle of the highway that went by the cemetery because people's GPSs were off. But in any case, the records were found. And they have over 500,000 cemeteries in their collection that they have at least one stone for. And they have cemeteries in 130 countries around the world. The goal for Billion Graves, by the way, the reason they have that name is that they wanted to have a site where there were 1 billion records of burials. They've got a ways to go. They're about 1/5 of the way there because they have 175 million burial records. Now, is Billion Graves free? Well, the answer could be yes, sort of. Remember, they're owned by a company, and therefore, because they're owned by somebody, the company wants to make money. And so in this case, they have a free access that you can use, any of us can use, but it's very limited in what you're able to do. You see the short list and the free column there. If you pay $5 a month or a year, pay $5 a year, you get more access. And then if you pay $9.99 a month, you get full access. And what happens is with these other access levels, you're able to access the GPS, you're able to see who's buried next to your relative, and a lot of things like that that you can't see just as a general person going to their site. Do realize you do need to register for the free account just to use the site. You just don't go in and use it without registering at all. Okay, then there's Find a Grave, which states that they have over 250 million, and I have 250,000, 250 million memorials. But remember, this is worldwide. They're not all in the US. So they're not really covering everything in the US, but they have more than any other one site does have. The one thing about them is, as opposed to billion graves, you do not have to have a stone's image. And so that allows more things to be put up, but it also allows for some people to do guessing and things like that. So you have to be a little bit careful when you're using Find a Grave as far as whether things are accurate or not. Okay, is it free? Really free? Yes, it really is. And there are some places where they will ask you for money, but none of that affects your ability to use the site and get full benefit from the site. Okay, it's owned by Ancestry. You can find a Grave records over at Family Search. But the best place to search for Find a Grave is actually at Ancestry. And we'll talk about that. Okay, searching Find a Grave can be tricky. I've often criticized Family Search because their search engine's a little bit tricky. But Find a Grave is really a tough site to work with because it really is GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. You've got to put in whatever you put in is what you're going to get back. Nothing more, nothing less. And if you put in Henry Harrison Sands, you'll never get Henry H. Sands. And so you have some issues like that you've got to learn to work with. Okay. And so they've talked about, they've improved their search engine. It's still funky, but it's better. And they give you a list of things that you can do. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about them, but do realize there are some things you can do there. Actually, one of the best ways to search for somebody, if you know for sure what their last name's going to be on their tombstone, and you think you know the cemetery, is to search by going to the cemetery itself first, and then it'll have a box for you to search in the cemetery, and just put the last name in. Then you'll get everybody with that last name, and hopefully you're not looking for Smith or Jones, Thomas, those common names. But you should be able to find your person if they're in Find a Grave. I've also found that it works real good if you find the record, let's say at Find a Grave. You can then use the exact information that you find on that memorial over at Family Search to find them. If it's not coming up at Family Search, put in that actual death record, date, birth date, name, the way it is on the stone, and it'll often pull that record up at Family Search. So this is a basic memorial. I've stripped off some of this stuff. This is my second great grandfather, Henry Harrison Sands. And so up at the top, it'll be his birth and death data, burial information, his name. And this particular site is not ad free, but I cut out most of the ads that were found on the page. If you want it to be an ad-free site for your relative for that one page, you do have to go in and pay a $10 fee And that'll remove all the ads. It will also allow you to put up to 10 photos on that page. Okay, one of the things you want to do is to compare the birth and death data that's on the memorial up there where it has its full dates of their birth and death with what's actually on the stone, which in this case, the stone only has the years. And that should be a warning that, there's a chance there's something that might not be accurate here. Now, of course, I'm the person that created this particular memorial, so you can trust me. I've got the right birth and death information. I actually got him off the death certificate for him. I also have the family Bible and several different things. Okay, also found on these memorials often are biographical information. Excuse me. That biographical information often has things like a death certificate, even, or a birth record included there. There is a section for family where if the people working with this stone want to show how this person is related to other people and find a grave, you might be able to find the parents showing so that you can go straight to the parents from this page, and the person's siblings, the person's spouse or spouses, and children. And so that's a very nice thing. You do have to be aware that people have done this, and so they may not be accurate, but most of the time they are. Okay, there'll also be suggestions for more searching. In other words, if we found Henry Harrison Sands in Crevlin Cemetery, we could come over here and click on Crevlin Cemetery and then put in the word Sands. And it's going to show me everybody else with the last name Sands buried in that cemetery. Or since Crevlin is in the city of Alameda in Columbia County, I can click on Alameda and put in Sands, and it'll show me everybody buried in Alameda who has the last name of Sands. Or I can expand that to the county, Columbia County, or to the state, Pennsylvania, or to the whole US. Those last ones aren't that valuable in doing this with, but the cemetery, the city, and the county levels can be very helpful for finding others in the family who are in Find a Grave. You got to remember that. Okay, there's a link here where you can have flowers delivered to that memorial, the actual memorial, in that cemetery for $99. They also will show you records that are on Ancestry that might pertain to this person. So I see the Pennsylvania death certificate for Henry because he died in Pennsylvania, and Ancestry has those. It'll tell you who created the memorial, what the memorial's number is, because that's important oftentimes for tracing down memorials, is to know their actual number. And then there's a link for the citation for this page if you're doing footnotes. And then it will also show you the path to the memorial. And you start with memorials and you go to the region, North America, to US, to Pennsylvania, to Columbia County, to Alameda, Crevlin Cemetery, and then his grave. Okay, so that's kind of what a memorial page in Find a Grave looks like. It's huge, but it isn't complete. You've got to keep remembering that. And the issues are that some cemeteries are missing, and not all graves in a cemetery are always listed. And then there's the possible inaccuracies. People who guessed that their relatives were buried there. Or memorials will often be embellished with false or speculative material, or the relationships shown on that memorial and Find a Grave are not really accurate. So there are some things you need to be aware of and watch for. Okay, sources. Tombstones are a derivative source. That means they're not a primary source. They're not something that was often created right when the person died, usually shortly thereafter, but sometimes long after. The stone you see there was actually created in 2019. And John, my dear great grandfather, died in 1852. But he didn't have a stone, so the family chipped in the money and we went together and put the stone up. And so, just because the stone's there doesn't make it correct, but hopefully our family did an accurate job of recording the information, hopefully. Okay, find a grave itself isn't a primary source. It's derivative and has derivative information. Thus, everything here should be evaluated carefully for accuracy. In other words, try to find another record that has the same information. And memorials with a stone can be judged based on what the stone shows, at least. Memorials without a stone need to be really carefully evaluated. If they don't show you a stone, treat it as questionable. Okay, examples of problems. This top one is a memorial for one of my ancestors, and there's no stone image that goes with it. And the middle name is not true. He never had any record where it said Newton was his middle name. And so, in fact, they once had a stone attached to this person, but the dates on the stone were for totally different years than what is there, which is the best we know of his birth and death information. Okay, so that's an example of why you've got to be careful with records that don't actually show a stone. Okay, this memorial at the bottom does have a stone, but the stone only gives the years, and the memorial has full dates. So which is to be believed? Well, we know from studying the records that this John Newton Givens, who really was John Newton Givens, the dates on the memorial page, the full birth date and the partially full death date actually came from the Social Security Death Index. And so even though it's not marked on his Find a Grave record, that's where those dates came from, and they are in fact okay. But that's the kind of thing you should do to verify things, because the stone itself does not tell us that. Okay, another one is this beautiful stone for Robert Pogue, who died in 1774. I can assure you that is not the original stone. In fact, it was created and placed there around 1950 by a gentleman who wrote a book on Robert Pogue and his descendants. And part of the purpose for this stone was to chisel in the wife's name, Elizabeth Preston, because he wanted people to feel that Elizabeth Preston was the wife of Robert Pogue. The fact is that with proof that we have found since that time, her name was really Elizabeth Rennick. But his attempts to validate Elizabeth Preston by putting her on that stone has caused a lot of havoc within the family. So you have to be careful, even when there's a stone, when you can realize that a stone obviously is not an original. You need to be careful of it. And then sometimes you're not going to find stones. My great grandfather, John Craig Givens, is buried in St. Charles, Missouri, and he's buried in a potter's field. Thankfully, the sexton's record book records his burial, And we knew where to go to look for his burial from just happening to have a uh, or having a death certificate for him from back in, oh heavens, the 1890s or something like that, long before the state of Missouri started death certificates. But the city of St. Charles did have death certificates. It named the cemetery, but there was no cemetery today with that name. So we went, when we were in St. Charles, to the Historical Society, and they said, "Oh yeah, it's over at this other cemetery now. That cemetery got renamed. It's now called such and such." And we went over there, and sure enough, in the sexton's records were my grandfather's burial information, saying he was buried in this potter's field. So sometimes that's the best you're going to come up with. Okay, now there's a new thing called cemeteries at Family Search. And you find it on the search menu down near the bottom where it says cemeteries. And this new feature is interesting. There's a caveat. The only people you're going to find on this search are people who are in the family search tree, who obviously are dead, and whose burial information includes the cemetery as part of the location. And that's important because back in the early days, back in New Dot Family Search days, and even early days with FamilySearch.org, they wanted us to not put cemeteries in the location field because that would mess up the standards. Now they've actually asked us to include it, and yet there are people going around. I have some in my family tree, my part of the tree, that are going through and stripping the cemeteries out of the records. Well, when they do that, you're not going to be able to locate these people because the only people that are going to come up have to have the cemetery listed in the burial records for their person. Okay. Now there's two ways to search. You can start your search by searching for a location. Like I could say I want to go Arizona, and I'll go drill down from that. Or I could start with a name, or I could do both. In fact, both is probably the best way to search. Give a place and a name. Or you can go, and they have a world map that you can drill down into that's going to show you all the cemeteries in the location that the map is showing. And then you can click on them, and then you can drill down into them to see who's listed as buried there. So how does that place search work? Here's an example. I have a lot of relatives buried in Glenbar, Arizona. And so I put in Glenbar, and then I chose where the gray area is there, Glenbar, Pima, Arizona, United States. And that's a standard, so that should work. And it says, okay, here are cemeteries in that location or close by. Okay, they're not all in Glenbar. Central, and that's actually a community, Eden, Pima, there's a Hubbard Cemetery, a Rogers Cemetery, a Bryce Cemetery, so there's some family cemeteries. I can filter by either the site type or by cemeteries or by relatives. We'll talk about that. Okay, I can also view these 9 options on a map. But I know this is the cemetery I want, the Glenbar Cemetery, which is found in Pima, Graham County, Arizona. Okay, Now, how does a person search work? Well, I put in my dad's name, his full name, and I did a search, and it says, oh, there's too many matches for that. I really question that. I don't think there's too many, but they say so. So the option here is to do like I said before, add a location to go with the name. And so I'll add Arizona to it to narrow the search down. So I put Arizona in, and it says, okay, we've got one site, South Lawns Memorial Cemetery in Tucson. Sure enough, that's where my dad's buried. And those filters aren't really going to make any difference at this point. For whatever reason, they don't really do much when we're at this level and we basically have found our person. Okay, there's just one cemetery that came up, and that's my father's record. And I do have a clue there. It says, be sure to use the name that the person is known by in the tree, because even though on his stone it says Joseph J. Givens, I want to put Joseph James Givens in because that is his name on his person page. And this whole system is based upon the name that's on the person page as the formal name. So make sure you're using that name and not any variation. Okay, if you want to go to a location search, okay. I said, okay, we're looking for Glenbar Cemetery. I can then do a relative search in that cemetery. What's so cool is it knows who's related to me and who isn't. Because, I mean, this is family search, and they know how people are related in tree. I can click and say, I want to see relatives only. At first, there were 150 burials that were found. I have over here the additional links to the cemetery, and I can go to Billion Graves for this cemetery, or I can go to Find a Grave for this cemetery. But if I just stay here in Glenbar, I can add a person to the family search cemetery list by clicking on the person, and they'll ask me who. I'll have to give them their ID, and I probably should go in and edit their burial location and add Glenbar Cemetery. So it doesn't just say Pima Graham, Arizona, because Pima Graham, Arizona is not going to get them placed in this cemetery. And Harriet Viola Ballard happened to be the first alphabetically of the 150 people that were found. But if I switch to show my relatives only, that cut it down to 33. But I do have 33 different people in that cemetery that are my relatives. And the first two they show, I've cut off the others, are my grandfather and my great grandfather. So you can see that I have some real close relatives in this Pioneer Cemetery. That's kind of how it works. And that to show the relatives is interesting because oftentimes it's going to be missing people you know should be there. And that's your clue that their record needs to be updated with their burial cemetery put in the location of burial. And it's so nice when you see these relatives pop up because you can go straight to their page in family search. Okay, so the bottom line is none of these sites have everything. It's estimated that 500 million people have lived in the United States, and not all of them, at least the dead ones, not all of them do show up on any website or in any book. So we still have a ways to go to get everybody recorded. The largest site, Find a Grave, has just a fraction of all the possible burials. And there are many sites that have cemetery records, as you've seen tonight. And hopefully you will try out some of these other locations. When Find a Grave doesn't help you, go look at the others. And so the real bottom line is we need to see if we can find on all of these various sites the person we're looking for, since one site won't always show everything. And I love that's a picture of Ralph Waldo Emerson's grave back in Massachusetts. Very unique stone. Okay, don't forget the major sites. All the major sites, Family Search, Ancestry, Find My Past, and My Heritage, have many databases that include burial records. Not just the ones we've shown you today specifically, but they have DAR books with transcriptions of gravestones, cemetery records found in private collections now housed at these sites, such as the Charles R. Hale Collection of Vital Records in Connecticut, which has millions of burials. And then consider the Family Search Wiki. Every location described there will have links to cemetery records for that area. And it'll often show you some things that you may not be aware of or may not find otherwise. And then don't forget our county historical and genealogical societies. Most of them have transcribed cemeteries in their local area. They've either put those transcriptions online or they're in books in their collection. So don't forget those. So in conclusion, be sure to search for other sources related to death, not just Find a Grave. Look for death certificates, obituaries, mortician records, sexton records, journals, diaries. Don't forget the newspaper. Hopefully your family won't come across the one that's shown there. I love that tombstone, standard gray. Good for goodbye for someone with the name Grady. In other words, you might be able to repurpose a tombstone that way. But in any case, don't forget there are many different kinds of records that you can go to get burial information, which will lead you to the death information that you need. If you like this presentation, don't forget to click like. Also subscribe to our channel. You'll get notified whenever we have a new presentation that's posted. Notice that the videos are all listed there, all of our videos. And that link is right underneath the F where it says videos. If you click on that link, that will show you a total list of all 96 or 7 videos that we have in our library, kind of in the order that they were posted from the most recent to the oldest. And then also there's this little blue link that can take you to our blog. And at our blog, you'll be able to download a PDF file that will have all the slides for that particular presentation. Each presentation is found in that blog, and on each of them, there's a link to get a PDF of the slides. And then that way you can copy and paste the links and things like that that are on some of the pages without having to write them down madly. And then hope you transcribe it right. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. I hope you've enjoyed our presentation. We'll be back again in 2 weeks now that we're off our vacation. And we wish you good luck in your researching, and we will see you then.